And when then in 1991 the Soviet Union collapses and the archives opened, how did that, was that a really sort of big change in what you could do and what you could imagine doing?
It was wonderful, actually. I mean, it was a totally incredible thing, because I think nobody had predicted the collapse. However, people may say that they did, but they I think really didn't. So it was a big surprise to everybody. Now, what happened was that the archives, at least the archives of the Communist Party, became open. We had archival access before, but mainly to on relatively safe sort of things like education and coming out of the state archives. And the party was the party side was the more important. Now, with come 1991, the very important secret police archives did not, in general, open, although you got some, if I remember, out in Sverdlovsky, Katerinburg. But that was in this upheaval period, and they didn't remain accessible to people for a long time. But nevertheless, the thing is, the archives open, you can suddenly go to the provinces. Before we were limited, it was very hard to go anywhere except Moscow or Leningrad, wherever you'd been sent. So you can go out and work on provincial archives. You can do oral history, all sorts of things that were just ruled out before became possible. And for me, that coincided with my moving to Chicago and getting all these great graduate students, of whom you were one, actually. That was I hadn't had really graduate students in any number before. I had some in Texas, but I didn't think, anyway, I hadn't had a lot. And so moving to Chicago, having those graduate students with archives opening up all over. And you remember, I mean, people went to all sorts of places, distant places, different archives, so that the net result was of finding out very quickly, for me, much more of the new archival sort of treasure trove that I could have done on my own if it had just been me. So that was a great time for me.
So, but the whole that social history of the 1930s was something that you had begun long before the archives opened.
Oh,
so
right.
Those two books surely sort of developed on the basis of a lot of work that you had done before the archives opened.
And right, because as I said, some of I incorporate some of the new archives, but mainly those works had been conceived before, and on the basis of the kind of archival material I could get access to then. In the case of Stalin's Peasants, I found that there was a great body of material of letters that peasants had written to a peasant newspaper in the 1930s. Krestianskaya Gazeta. And so that was, I thought, a great source. Now, when the archives opened and the party archives were, there was, of course, the possibility of going back and checking, were you right or were you not right? But in general, well, I thought, that was not a big problem for me. Perhaps it would have been if I'd been talking about political history, but I mean, basically the party archives for my kind of stuff tended to provide more, confirmation. Now, in the case of, but no, perhaps a bit more than that, because the resistance theme, I'm trying to think of the sequence, certainly the fact that archives open, the classified archives in which you had reports of anti-Soviet feeling in the countryside, they became accessible to me, and that became a part of my story. But I think the resistance theme was already there. It's just that some more kinds of data came up.
Right. And having then come into contact, as we all did, with this amazing treasure trove of new documents, and all that your graduate students and others were exploring in all sorts of different ways in different places. Where did you proceed? How did you decide where to go from this social history of the 1930s? What drew you?
Well, yes. Then it was at that point, at the beginning of towards the late 80s, I'd been dealing with social history and I'd been trying not to deal with class. I mean, you know, my sense was class was, class is the category the Marxists, the Soviets use, and they use it in a static way and it's totally uninteresting and so avoid it if you can. That was my attitude. But there's a sort of niggling worry about this. Because after all, I did in my upward mobility stuff, I did draw on the concept of proletarian. And even if I said, well, it really means lower class, but in general, there was a problem about class and about social categories that I felt I'd been avoiding.
Mm-hmm.
Everyday Stalinism is very notable for avoiding any kind of social categories. You know, I don't talk about workers and white-collar people. I just don't do that in that book. I write about strategies which urban citizens in general get employed. But there's a niggling worry about class because it always seemed to me it never described properly what was actually in the society. At the same time, it was obviously terribly important, these class terms that they're throwing around. So that's what I came to in the book that became Tear Off the Masks. I was thinking, well, okay, let's acknowledge that class is important and yet not adequately descriptive of things going on and work out what it's doing. And I got the sense of the tremendous importance of class labeling and acquiring for yourself the right class label. In other words, acquiring an identity of, let's say, proletarian or poor peasant. And that identity is one that is actually, after a while, written in your passport, but it's also written in your earlier identity documents. It affects your whole, it affects whether you can, what category of rations you get, whether you can get into college, whether you can continue in high school, all these things, whether you can get an apartment. So the uses of class and the ways in which people constructed identities for themselves, which it enabled them to prosper in this particular situation, of what I turn to in Tear Off the Masks.
Do we want to get into post-revisionism?
Sure, yeah.
So is that sort of cultural history, if we can we call it cultural history? Tear Off the Masks.
Well,
in a political culture
I
sense.
suppose you can. It's focused on. It's very much focused on behaviors, and that is like. That is like everyday Stalinism. They're both focused on people's behavior. Everyday Stalinism is mainly about their behavior getting goods. And not getting into trouble, and Tear Off the Masks is about their behavior in constructing themselves and creating good dossiers on themselves. This sort of construction of file selves was what I called that. But of course, there you're getting into identity. It was my particular way. Lots of people were doing identity studies at that point, and which I guess comes under cultural history, and I was doing it too, but in my own way, because identity studies in general studies of subjectivity tend to be a bit kind of amorphous for me. But so I was doing self-identification rather than a broader concept of identity, but it fits. But it was my sort of, perhaps it was involved a reaction to the general turn in the field, which was towards cultural history, starting with the so-called linguistic turn.
So no one was anymore talking about the sort of system from above and from below, as that revisionist debate was carrying things in the 1970s and 80s. How had it changed by the 1990s and into this decade?
Well, I think a lot of the revisionist, what had happened, two things had happened. One is the field did one of the fields move. They'd moved in the 60s, 70s from political to social history, and then in the 90s they start to move social to cultural history. but in doing that, it always involves quite a lot of formal repudiation or criticism of what's gone before. But there always is too a very large amount of absorption of what has gone before, and just taking it for granted that that's how it is. I don't think now that you talk about, people are not particularly interested in upward mobility, but they don't deny it happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not what
It's
they're
accepted.
looking at. So that's an example. But in one particular respect, the people, they start to call themselves post-revisionists, but so maybe we can call that term, use that term. They in a way return to the question of support, which was the original revisionist question, social support for the regime. What social support was there? They returned to it, not looking at in such specific ways as we did, but looking very much, assuming, making the assumption, this starts with Stephen Kotkin and Magnetic Mountain, making the assumption, which is contrary to a lot of particularly the earlier, not the Soviet, not the revisionist scholarship, but the early one, making the assumption that most people in most societies accept the situation they're in and try to learn the rules of it. And so in the Soviet Union too, they're all, in Kotkin's terms, all his people are trying to learn to speak Bolshevik. They're not running around thinking critically. They're trying to, they accept this worldview. It's the one that's around, and they want to become more fluent in its expression. And that's being developed by a number of scholars of the younger generation. Jochen Helbeck, with Revolution on My Mind, is a good example. So you had a younger group of scholars focusing very much on the subjective experience of, in particular, of Stalinism.